These fuckers have broken me. They fucking got me. I lost everything and everybody. I don't even exist anymore. The nice car, beautiful wife, long money, healthy family are all gone. Out of sight, out of mind. I'm in here getting treated and I don't even have a shoulder to lean on outside of old school. I own my wrongs. I lived a fucked up life. I didn't value my life, so how could I value others? I've taken life and I have to take what comes with that. But am I not entitled to redemption? This country was built on kidnapping, rape, murder, and slavery. Yet those who participated were given a shot at redemption. The world forgave this country for their sins. So why can't I get a second chance? How is this shit fair? I've spent my lifetime focused on survival, and I lost my life to an enemy I didn't even know existed. The fucking system. The system is far from broken. It's designed to do exactly what it's doing. I once told Buddha that I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Little did I know, that was a lie.
Derek Davis's story is one that's been told many times, in many ways, by the innumerable souls who have been crushed by the carceral system. The title of his book, Judged by 12, has a twofold meaning. Of course, it alludes to the jury, which delivered his verdict, but it also hints at something deeper, that he was prejudged by society at the age of 12. That is when events were set in motion which would lead to 2 lives being cut short, 1 receiving a life sentence, and a family being torn apart, all for the want of a meager egg roll. We'll be returning to Derek's story, but for now, let's figure out how things got to where they are today. Then we'll be asking, what could be done better? A lot of ink has been spilled debating the merits of defunding the police as well as defending them. Various protests against police brutality and Back the Blue counter-protests have been carried out. All manner of study has been conducted trying to make sense of police behavior, state violence, and carcerality in general. Politicians lean towards the majority opinion that police and prison reform is a kind of compromise. Over the course of this essay, we will explore a more foundational question. What are police and prisons? What were they established to do? And under what circumstances did they come about? What were the thought processes used by those who first implemented what we see today? And why are so many people okay with the injustices that we see year after year perpetuated by this institution? By understanding the past, it is my hope that we can better understand the present and chart a course into the future. Welcome to Ideas Matter. One of the stumbling blocks when discussing police is that it is very difficult for most folks to conceive of a world without them. However, it's worth recognizing that what we think of as the modern police force is a relatively new invention. For most of history, something very different has been used to serve the community in this capacity. What we know as the modern police force has its roots as an export from the United Kingdom, but the model gets adapted to local conditions wherever it's been implemented. Britain has a long history of dabbling in various forms of law and order. All the way back in the 9th century, it founded the office of the sheriff, which was empowered to call up a posse or group of citizens to assist in the security of the county and observance of law. This model placed a great deal of power and trust in the hands of the community. If a sheriff believed a lawbreaker would not cooperate with the enforcement of law, they would have to convince others to join in the cause to make an arrest or take other disciplinary action. For the most part, sheriffs sought to mediate disputes as often as they could, and to seek compromises to the satisfaction of all parties involved in the dispute. There were no huge prisons to house large numbers of prisoners, no armies of guards to watch over them. The darker aspect to this was when a remedy under the law could not be found or was not sought, they far too often resorted to hangings, especially between the 11th and 13th centuries. Under this form of law enforcement, however, the law ended up more closely reflecting the attitudes and values of any given county or community. This is not to say that it was an especially progressive or equitable system on its face, but it's worth examining and understanding the power differential within this system. If a population overwhelmingly objected to a law that was imposed on them, it would be very difficult for a sheriff within that population to assemble a posse to pursue someone who broke that particular law. Also, if a particular county or community were being underserved by the law in general, it would be very easy for them to effectively refuse to be governed altogether. So, let's talk about Ireland. In the early 18th century, Ireland was under British rule as a colony. Most of the farmland in Ireland was owned by a small group of Anglo-Irish families loyal to England and belonging to the Anglican Church, who heavily employed Catholic peasants to labor on these farms and bolster their own wealth. This Catholic population was disallowed from holding office, sitting in Parliament, and ultimately denied the right to vote at all. Their lands were seized by force and legal trickery, disrupting estate inheritances. Presbyterians were also oppressed under this system, but not as severely. And of course, any non-Christians were heavily persecuted. With this backdrop in the 18th century, the Catholic and Presbyterian populations found themselves moved by revolutionary and anti-colonial thinking and various revolutionary actions that were taking place in the United States, France, and elsewhere. Fearing the loss of yet another colony, Britain did try to make some legal concessions, but none of it truly addressed the wrongs that had been done. There was no willingness to restore lands which had been stolen or fairly compensate for economic losses or exploitation. This culminated in a failed rebellion against Britain by the United Irishmen, and in retaliation, the right of Ireland to self-govern was stripped away entirely. Now, however, Britain had a problem on their hands. They had abolished the effective government in Ireland, but needed a way to enforce their laws upon their newly subjugated population. The system of sheriffs and posses, of local magistrates and grand jurors, was not working very well to this end. Many of the people were still largely possessed of a rebellious spirit, and raising a posse to make an arrest of another Irishman for not obeying Britain's laws, especially their tax laws, was unreliable at best. The prolonged hunger from poverty and the sting of oppression were still felt, and only kept in check by the perpetual presence of an occupying military force. However, this was not sustainable. It was increasingly expensive to keep troops spread across Ireland just for the sake of enforcing law, and their presence was increasing rebellious sentiment. Enter Sir Robert Peel. Peel, a deeply anti-Catholic Tory, built upon a law called the Insurrection Act in order to shift the power dynamic of law back to the state. The Peace Preservation Act, or its formal title, a bill to provide for the better execution of laws of Ireland by appointing superintending magistrates and additional constables in counties in certain cases, was passed into law on July 25, 1814. This piece of legislation established magistrates appointed by Britain rather than locally, and empowered the Lord Lieutenant of a county or borough, or any of these magistrates, to call in a group of special full-time constables called the Peace Preservation Force, or Peelers informally. This force was not from the community. They did not answer to anyone in the community. They were a group of carefully selected men, armed and equipped with carbines and bayonets, whose salaries were paid by extracting the expenses from the communities they were deployed to. Peel had found a way to make Ireland pay for its own subjugation. Bear in mind, this was all established in order to avoid providing any real concessions to an oppressed group of people over ethnic and religious lines. The magistrates and peelers themselves were being selected by individuals who supported this oppression. The people being oppressed had no ability to vote against this bill. They had no voice in Parliament to object to it. As a result, codifying this bigotry was a key feature of this system. One might even call it systemic oppression. Even at the time this was noted, one General Matthew, sympathetic to the Catholic plight, spoke to Parliament in 1817, noting,
"While the former was liable to be carried off without a moment's notice by a set of fellows well known in Ireland by the name of peelers, and then to be harried before a set of intolerant and bigoted Orange magistrates."
Over the next 2 years, the outrages caused by actions taken by this force on the population was so extreme that intense backlash occurred. When it did, the peelers tapped the Insurrection Act itself and called in the backing of the army. After all, their presence was backed directly by the state. The absurdity of some of the excessive arrests made by peelers was made famous in the Irish folk poem turned song Peeler and the Goat, which tells the story of a peeler harassing and pursuing the arrest of a goat for vagrancy. If denying land ownership and inflicting poverty on a particular ethnic group and then arresting them for vagrancy sounds familiar, well, that's because it is. And the shifting of power dynamics is the important aspect of this that I want to focus on, examine, and understand here. Law enforcement went from something that the population largely carried out amongst themselves, taking the state's direction, to something that the state itself carried out directly, backed up with guns, and ultimately backed up with military force. This, in a very real way, removed any true ability to consent to be governed. There was no longer a choice in the matter, and no way for a community to reject an unjust law or burden being placed upon them. It replaced one type of military occupation with another, more specialized at suppressing insurrection and compelling obedience under penalty of death. And I think it should go stated again that the former system had survived since the 9th century. It was purely imperialist greed and fear of losing another colony that drove this change. Peel's campaign was so successful in suppressing Irish rebellion that it ultimately was adopted and adjusted to replace sheriffs in general. First, in the Metropolitan Police Force for London, run out of Scotland Yard, and then exported throughout the rest of England, and its colonies and former colonies. This system was sold to the public as an alternative to using the army to back sheriffs up to enforce order. However, it was strictly modeled after the military itself. Julian Goh notes in his study on imperial feedback theory, the Irish constabulary was a heavily armed instrument of the English colonial state, created to suppress anti-colonial uprising and other outbreaks of rural disorder. When creating the London Metropolitan Police as an alternative to the army, Peel's inspiration was this colonial force. The centralized structure of the London police under civilian control, the spatial division of the force, the titles of superintendent and sergeant, and even the personnel, these and other components of the London Metropolitan Police were all taken from the Irish constabulary. In simpler terms, it was bringing the military occupation of Ireland back home to London with a fresh coat of paint. This opened doors which were previously closed, especially in establishing new laws and levying new taxes. When the population was largely in charge of enforcing the laws, it was very difficult to enforce unpopular or unjust ones, and doing so risked non-compliance or revolt. Having a state-run counterinsurgency force occupying every city and county, charged with enforcing, with violence, whatever laws came out of the seat of government, removed these concerns of popular resistance. But why am I talking about the United Kingdom? One important aspect of imperial feedback theory is that empires and former colonies of those empires do not develop in a vacuum. Other imperialist powers and former colonies that were fledgling nations unto themselves saw what England had developed. They sought to adapt it to their own domestic situations. Chief among them was the young nation of the United States. The United States at this time had two key systems operating in parallel. The first was a series of watchmen and sheriffs, which was the commonplace form of law enforcement at the time, as we previously discussed. The other was a series of slave patrols, who were charged with catching escaped slaves. These patrols operated well before the United States was an independent nation. However, at this time, the patrollers were falling out of favor in some areas, as the institution of slavery was becoming steadily less popular. It relied on individuals to join the patrols when called, but especially in the North and some parts of the Middle States, a growing number of people were refusing to join in the hunting of slaves. With the advent of the formal police force in England, the keys to a more intense form of oppression were at hand. Gone were the days of relying on community policing and forming up posses to go after escaped slaves. Now, slave patrols could be institutionalized into the state itself and married alongside law enforcement itself. This empowered states to be much harsher in dealing with civil unrest, and allowed them to overrule any public sentiment against the institution of slavery. As within England, this new system also allowed for much more aggressive laws to be passed. It is arguable that without the establishment of this modern police force throughout most of the United States, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 would not have been enacted, as there would have been no effective mechanism by which to enforce it. The intensity of cruelty against the enslaved black population was set to a fever pitch. It could no longer be tempered by popular opinion in some areas who refused to cooperate with slave catching. Now the state was operating the institution entirely on its own, backed up with its own guns, and those who did seek to free slaves would find themselves on the wrong side of the law as well. As within England, it's important to understand and examine how, in the United States, the power dynamic had fundamentally changed. Freed black people, even in the North, were finding themselves now brutalized by the police, and laws were being developed in rapid succession even after the Civil War in order to maintain the oppression of the black population, a kind of de facto slavery. And since the state no longer had to worry about the population enforcing or even really understanding these laws, they could be particularly inventive and cruel about them. There is an excellent video essay by Knowing Better called Neo-Slavery, examining all of the legal creations that were set up in the United States to maintain slavery long after emancipation, linked below. Returning now to our initial understanding of the inception of police, we can better examine their behavior and how their targets are chosen. It should be said, this is not per se a deliberate, conscious choice made by individual officers, rather the institution following the incentives and foundational goals that they operate by. Police in the United States were initially central in targeting fugitive slaves, freed black people, and members of the abolitionist movement. They were present at any protests and riots with the stated goal of maintaining order. This is in the same way that order was being maintained against the Irish, with the dispensing of violence against people who were calling out and fighting against injustice. In effect, police are charged with the maintaining of negative peace within the community. Martin Luther King Jr. made the distinction in this way. Peace is not merely the absence of some negative force, war, tensions, confusion, but it is the presence of some positive force, justice, goodwill, the power of the kingdom of God. What he's getting at there is that you have to look a little deeper to identify if peace truly exists within a community. It isn't merely the absence of public displays of protest. And when we understand all of this history, it becomes crystal clear why police are a constant presence at every single protest and social movement throughout modern history. It explains why they are the instruments so commonly brought in to break worker strikes. It brings into focus why police are consistently pitted against marginalized communities. Their foundational purpose is to silence expressions of unrest. The institution itself was designed from the first day it was penned into existence to act as a projection of state power in order to subjugate those who would fight against and speak out against injustice. And to reiterate, this is not a choice that individual police officers make. This is their functional purpose as an institution. You can fire an entire police department and put in all new officers, and it will trend towards this direction because that is what they were foundationally designed to do. I emphasize this point as an explanation for why reform efforts consistently fail to achieve any lasting change. A useful term needs to be introduced here: the carceral class. This group of people is made up of all communities underserved by the state. Those who have historically been oppressed and persecuted, denied economic opportunity, and kept out of positions of power and civic engagement. The term carceral class alludes to the way that, rather than seeking to address the injustices against these communities and the harms done to them, the police are instead deployed and bolstered to silence those grievances, maintaining the harm in perpetuity. This process ensures that these groups are constantly in tension with the law and thus bound to prison or to be killed by police at much higher rates than groups more adequately served by the state. It is also because of this function that law enforcement is so appealing to reactionaries, and why there is such overlap between white supremacist groups and police departments. The former believes that there should be a racial hierarchy of power within society, and the latter serves as a mechanism to maintain such a hierarchy. This is all getting a bit academic, though, so let's bolt it down for a moment to more human stories. Let's revisit the story of Derek Davis mentioned at the introduction of this essay. At the early age of 12, he and his siblings were regularly facing hunger, going 1, 2, sometimes 3 days without a full meal. His father had been caught up by the carceral system and was in prison. His mother was doing the best she could to maintain a household on a single income, but could barely keep on top of the bills. She was overwhelmed to the point of suicidal ideation at times. Derek loved his mother and his siblings. He wanted to help her out, to shoulder some of the burdens she was facing for him. He also wanted for himself and his siblings to stop suffering pangs of hunger on a weekly basis. This is a perfect example of a family underserved by the state. Derek's situation is illustrative of the challenges that so many households across the country face, especially in communities of color. One day, this young man, not even a teenager yet, went outside with $1 in his pocket to try and get an egg roll. It would be the first real food he'd eaten in days. Some local drug dealers in the neighborhood spotted him walking with a chip on his shoulder and checked in on him. When they heard about his plight, they gave him $20 and effectively a job offer to earn more. This pivotal moment in Derek's life clearly demonstrates two key things. First, the failure of the state to ensure the food and housing security for Derek's family created a need. Second, it shows a form of mutual aid within his community to fulfill that need. There is a reflexive instinct many people have been conditioned to simply dismiss gangs, drug dealers, and the like as purely predatory or even evil. We have largely been trained to see the world through the eyes of police and law. But if we take a moment to look at things from the eyes of this 12-year-old black youth, there's an opportunity at hand to help alleviate the hunger felt by himself and his siblings. An opportunity to give back to his mother who's breaking herself just to keep him alive with the bare minimum she can scrape together. For what reason should Derek not pursue this? Why should he have concern for the law when the law is what took his father away and denies him, his siblings, and his mother food and threatens to rob them of their home? This perspective is one alluded to in all of the studies which show that criminality is tied to poverty, and no matter how severely the state tries to punish it with law enforcement, with excessive prison sentences, hunger and need for shelter override concern for the law every time. This is not a story of right and wrong, but about pointing out that the use of police and law enforcement is not justice. Justice would be ensuring that they had enough to eat, not deny them food because the bills are too high. Justice would be making sure they stayed sheltered, not threatening them with being on the street. Justice would be reuniting Derek's family with his father, not keeping him locked away forever. This turning point in Derek's life was entirely avoidable, and it would have cost far less to just make sure that he and his family had food and had shelter than his decades of imprisonment later in his life. We'll be returning to Derek's story a bit later on in this essay, but for now, let's turn to yet another example of unequal outcomes.
I'm tired of teachable moments. I've been through that on my job my whole life. In order to talk about black on black crime, we have to talk about the government as much as we talk about black people. Folks want to talk about black on black crime. Let's talk about it. And let's talk about how we are overrepresented in prison. Let's talk about how their children never go to prison for what they do to us. Let's talk about how they're just like Trump, always deflecting. If our children mess up, and sometimes even if they don't, they go to prison. If their children mess up in ways our children can't even imagine, they become presidents of companies, politicians, and presidents of the United States.
Gwendolyn Wood's son, Mario, was killed by police on December 2nd, 2015, when 5 officers shot him repeatedly. Her words compellingly highlight the different justice systems that exist within the United States. For those in the carceral class, Black people, queer people, Muslims, Latinos, and other marginalized communities, law enforcement is always there to prevent the advocation of rights as human beings. The law is always there to keep them down through over-policing, through the use of force, and through the myriad of policies which keep them locked behind chains of poverty, gate-kept away from various forms of health and mental care due to significant financial costs. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, explores some of these very same policies and the long, long history of how they've been enacted and inflicted upon communities of color. The officers who killed Mario Woods were found to have used excessive force, but no disciplinary action was taken against them. They remained in their jobs, defended by a system which was designed from its first days to maintain hierarchies of power within society and to keep marginalized communities down. Gwendolyn Woods is correct that these teachable moments happen every single day, and it's exhausting. There are decades of studies on this. There's abolitionist literature going back centuries pointing out how this incarnation of law enforcement is just slavery with more steps. It's time we start really listening to these perspectives. As a final point for this chapter, let's talk about lethal force. Lethal force is the most egregious violation of rights built deep into the system of policing. There is a very long, if flawed, trial process that a suspect accused of a crime has a right to, complete with an appeals process, all built upon the correct idea that sometimes people get it wrong. Many innocent people are incarcerated for things they did not do, and many people are locked up for breaking unjust laws that are later repealed. Even with the trial process involving those in the district attorney's office, a judge and a courtroom, detectives, lawyers, a full jury panel, depositions. Even with that many eyes on a case, sometimes they get it wrong. This can be due to not having all the facts at the time of trial. It can be due to faked evidence or bad reporting by police. It can be based on biases within the jury or bad investigative work in general. It can be for many reasons. But sometimes, everyone involved gets it wrong. The Innocence Project estimates that 1 in 100 people convicted of crimes are falsely convicted. The presumption of innocence is not perfect, but it is intended to give people the best possible chance of determining the facts of a case. However, in the United States, we have been indoctrinated into accepting that over 800,000 individuals who wear badges are allowed to bypass this entire process, that their own individual judgment as flawed human beings is somehow elevated, that they, in the moment, are permitted to condemn someone else as guilty and deliver capital punishment, even in states which do not allow capital punishment. And every time it happens, the police get out ahead of it on the media in order to assassinate the character of the person they murdered, to justify it in the minds of the American people. But police do not have divine sight, even though they have done a very good job of convincing most of the nation that their circumvention of this essential part of the legal process is somehow normal and acceptable. Police are just one facet of the carceral system. For now, let's turn our attention to prisons. Like police, the modern prison is also a very young invention, and its function is not what we're led to believe it is. Let's take a closer look. Many of the changes to policing happened during the age of imperialism, and it's there that we have to return. and because of their continued inventiveness with law and order, we must once more turn our attention to Britain. They had been one of the early explorers, but they actually were not one of the earliest colonizers of the Americas like Spain and Portugal. At the time, England was largely busy paying a steep cost of integrating Wales. Initially, Wales was brought in as a largely autonomous state within the Union. However, Wales was not entirely content with the unequal treatment under the English banner. Perceiving a threat of rebellion, the Laws in Wales Act of 1542 was passed under Henry VIII, effectively ceasing much of their autonomy and bringing Wales firmly under English law and rule. Also, in this same time period, England was aggressively pursuing the annexation of Scotland. What they had failed to acquire diplomatically, they pursued with invasion. This years-long invasion was rebuffed, partially due to help from the French. While all of this was happening in Europe, Portugal and Spain had been leading the effort to colonize the Americas using slave trade, and were bringing the fruits of stolen labor back home. Spain was one of Britain's primary rivals, and Britain participated in a great deal of piracy, or privateering, seizing Spanish gains and sinking several of their ships. Many clashes with the Spanish Armada occurred between 1585 and 1604, but Britain wasn't content with just taking others' gains. They wanted to join in, to participate in the apparently lucrative conquest of the Americas that other nations were getting in on. They didn't initially have routes established to participate in the transatlantic slave trade, and their initial efforts failed spectacularly. Humphrey Gilbert attempted to establish a colony in Newfoundland, but failed to actually leave any settlers at the site and died on the route back home. Walter Raleigh founded the Roanoke colony in North Carolina, but the colony collapsed due to lack of supplies and preparedness. It wasn't until after signing the Treaty of London and ceasing conflict with Spain that England could actually put resources into colonizing in earnest. However, what they identified they needed was a labor force and bodies to occupy their colonial aspirations. Initially, they tried propaganda to convince people to willfully seek their fortune in the New World. This effort was subject to diminishing returns. The only truly successful efforts that voluntary colonization saw were from the mercantile class with vast resources in their trading companies and those seeking to flee religious persecution. They needed more bodies to serve as a labor force to better enrich the crown. In addition to joining the transatlantic slave trade, violating their previous ban on the practice, they also came up with another solution. They began offering criminals facing the death penalty a choice to instead go to the colonies as indentured servants. While this was initially done in a haphazard fashion, it became cemented as a systemic part of their legal apparatus by the 1650s. This created a strange new financial incentive to criminalize people, and the Crown financially supported the counties which rendered them the most convicts to be used as settlers. People caught up in this system became known as His Majesty's 7-year passengers, a particularly cynical term alluding to the 7 years of forced labor they were legally bound to, which frequently resulted in lifelong servitude in practice. The most common crime this group of incarcerated individuals had committed was petty theft. Something as simple as stealing a handkerchief could land you in the belly of a ship in shackles bound for a foreign land. Over 50,000 men, women, and children were pulled into the system and sent across the sea to the Americas between 1655 and 1776. One such story, in brief, is that of Elizabeth Howard, who was found guilty of stealing 3 yards of ribbon and a bit of silk lace. She was a 12-year-old girl at the time. One of the many living in poverty in England due to the steep amount of resources being spent on colonizing and the failure to invest domestically. For this crime, she was secured in the Newgate jail and then shipped off to a place she knew nothing about to be auctioned off to strange men. It does not require a great imagination to know what her life would be like in the Americas. Newgate jail, colloquially the Old Bailey, was one of several scattered facilities across England that did exist. These were designed to hold people temporarily, either to await trial or to await and carry out their hanging. Even with their very limited capacity, there was rampant exploitation and abuse which happened in these facilities. However, any sentences or imprisonment tended to be very short, if anyone were indeed committed to stay at the jail at all. While all of this history is interesting and tragic, why am I talking about it, and what does it have to do with the mass incarceration system and long prison sentences that we see today? In 1776, England had lost the American Revolutionary War, and we know from its treatment of Ireland that it was eager to shrug off its various losses and prove itself as an empire. This is about where the timeline merges with the previous chapter's creation of the modern police and the shifting of power of law enforcement more heavily into the state's hands. It entered a bit late, but it had found the penal system to be a great source of convict labor, and at the turn of the century, it intended on improving on this effort with the lessons learned over the last decades. It had also just established this new police force. The new police force was excellent at providing more convicts than ever before, but this presented new challenges. Newgate Jail and the few jail structures that did exist were proving extremely insufficient, so, lacking land structures for this purpose, Britain began converting several ships en masse into floating prisons, or prison hulks. The idea of housing large numbers of convicts on water was in part inspired by the slave trade itself, which Britain and other imperial powers had been particularly inventive about during the height of the transatlantic slave trade. This was a notable departure from how convicts had been treated thus far. I am not making this comparison to suggest that indentured servitude is somehow equal to the horrors of slavery. Rather, it is to draw attention to how elements of slavery itself were being incorporated into systems of carcerality and adopted into the system of law itself. Convicts were now spending months or years packed shoulder to shoulder with other convicts aboard a watery vessel with insufficient care, awaiting transfer to another watery vessel, a convict ship, as England turned its eyes on the Australian continent. Previously, convicts shared a vessel with passengers and supplies. However, this new brand of convict ship, bound to this penal colony, were oversaturated with bodies of the incarcerated. The arrival of the Second Fleet in Australia is described by Reverend Richard Johnson in these heartbreaking terms.
I beheld a sight truly shocking to the feelings of humanity, a great number of them laying, some half and others nearly quite naked, without either bed or bedding, unable to turn or help themselves. Spoke to them as I passed along, but the smell was so offensive that I could scarcely bear it. The landing of these people was truly affecting and shocking. Great numbers were not able to walk, nor to move hand or foot. Such were slung over the ship's side in the same manner as they would sling a cask, a box, or anything of that nature. Upon being brought up to the open air, some fainted, some died upon the deck, and others in the boat before they reached the shore. When come on shore, many were not able to walk, to stand, or stir themselves in the least. Hence, some were led by others. Some creeped upon their hands and knees, and some were carried upon the backs of others.
It is recorded that, of the male convicts arriving, 26% died on the voyage, and 40% died in the first 8 months of arrival at the colony. There were some changes made by the government to mitigate these losses. However, this was not out of some benevolent concern for the prisoners, but rather a concern for the economic losses. Separate ships, which carried female convicts, had much better mortality rates, but they also were described as floating brothels, and one can be sure that it was not the women who were receiving the money for the use of their own bodies. The Lady Juliana transport itself was reported to have arrived in Australia with over 30 children ready to be born, even though few, if any, of the women it carried had been pregnant when they set out from England. Back on land, jails continued to overflow into floating hulks, and these convict ships ferried them as rapidly as they could. While over 50,000 had been captured by the carceral system and sent to the Americas, the Australian expedition was over 3 times this figure in the same amount of time. Over 170,000 convicts were transported across 80 years to Australia. This cannot be attributed to some huge surge of criminal activity. Rather, what we see results from the introduction of this new financial incentive of having prisoners serve as a labor force, combined with the new system of policing, which makes mass numbers of arrest that much easier to achieve. These prison hulks were not a sustainable solution for the rate that Britain was imprisoning people, even as they shipped them off. And the jails were ill-equipped to handle mass incarceration. So, enter Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was an English philosopher and jurist, and is known for some of his writings on utilitarianism. He was opposed to slavery and capital punishment, and his ideas on the welfare of society were relatively progressive at the time. He had a novel idea that he was eager to implement to this end.
A building circular, the prisoners in their cells occupying the circumference, the officers in the centre. By blinds and other contrivances, the inspectors concealed from the observation of the prisoners, hence the sentiment of a sort of omnipresence. The whole circuit reviewable with little or without any change of place. One station in the inspection part affording the most perfect view of every cell.
Since the 1780s, he had been trying to sell his idea of the panopticon around England. This was one of the first attempts at a reformist system under the English system of law. In his vision and understanding, the reason criminals did what they did was because they felt they could get away with it, and for no other reason. This prison model, with a circular guard chamber, with tightly packed cells surrounding it across a yard, was intended to instill in prisoners a sense that they were always being watched. The guards did not always need to be watching, but the presence of the watchtower gave the illusion of omnipresent eyes. In his concept, the sense of always being under surveillance, either by God or society or law, would instill the necessary sense of shame and perhaps paranoia that would prevent future criminality. The intent to shift away from a system of hangings and convict labor to a reformist approach was ultimately a good intention. The philosophical premise and understanding of criminality, however, we know today to be rubbish. Bentham never actually got to realize his vision of the panopticon in his own designs. However, what we see emerging in Britain in this time frame are prisons incorporating many elements of the concept. In 1816, Millbank, the first state penitentiary ever, was constructed, with several others following. These structures were being built to meet the demand for longer-term confinement of large numbers of incarcerated people. These penitentiaries were not round in design and did not include a singular watchtower. They would house prisoners in many rows of cells. In the case of Millbank, a series of 6 pentagons, all surrounding the administrative complex at the center. The concept of surveilling prisoners more heavily was part of the design concept, and a yard for prisoners to be made to labor continued the pattern of using convicts as a source of income for England. Absent from these designs was any actual intention to reform them. Eventually, some prisoners of lesser crimes began being offered the opportunity to spend years in prison laboring rather than being shipped off via transport ship to the Australian colonies. That so many accepted this offer indicates how terrible the conditions for convicts were on prison transports. A key through line of the expansion of this system of convict labor is one of ever-expanding prison sentences. What was previously something like 40 days in the jail for assault now might be 10 years in a state penitentiary or lifelong transport to Australia to do hard labor. These are the building blocks which constitute the modern prison system. Excessively long sentences, an obsession with surveillance even after an incarcerated person has been released, the exploitation of a labor force compelled to do grueling work. As with police, various countries have adapted this system in various ways over the years. The United States has been particularly inventive with it. In the United States, we've managed to expand our carceral system to be able to capture even people who have not been found guilty of a crime and put them in situations where they must resort to criminality. At this time, we're going to clear up some common misunderstandings of the prison system in the United States. These misunderstandings may apply to other countries, but the data and numbers we're looking at are from the United States. First, let's get one thing out of the way. The stated intention of putting people in prison is to either deter them from doing more crimes or deter criminality in general. If that is the intention, the United States model is a colossal failure. Our recidivism rate is 76.6%. That is, 3 out of 4 people released from prison are rearrested within 5 years. If you have a system which fails to achieve its stated purpose 3 out of 4 times, you need to seriously reevaluate if that is the right system to achieve the goal, because something has gone terribly wrong. If it is to deter crime in general, it fails there as well. The United States has some of the harshest prison sentences, but it's still worse than average on crime rate compared to every other country in the world. If, however, we understand this system of mass incarceration was built for economic purposes and continues to this day for that same purpose, things continue to make a lot more sense. In the previous chapter, we talked about how economic factors can lead a person to criminality. Consider that 1 in 3 of the nearly 2 million people behind bars in the United States have not been tried and should be subject to the presumption of innocence. These individuals are frequently held for months or years at a time, during which they may lose their job to non-attendance, may lose their homes to inability to pay bills, and even if found innocent, may ultimately leave the jail system destitute. The bail system impacts over 500,000 people at any given time, and the number of people who have been jailed for long periods of time, later found innocent, who end up committing crimes later, is rather high. In simpler terms, this system creates criminals while denying people the presumption of innocence. And because these problems are avoidable if you have money, this reinforces maintaining the carceral class that we discussed. A common refrain of prison critics in the United States is that private prisons are one of the roots of the harm that it does. While certainly private prisons are an even more blatant form of exploitation, they are not the heart of the problem with the carceral system. Only 8% of prisoners are held in actual private prisons. However, there are much more insidious profits to be made with the system of mass incarceration. Besides the free labor force, state prison systems also contract out services like food and health, telecommunications, and the commissary system, which have created massive multi-billion-dollar industries in these spaces. The growth of the carceral class is seen as job creation by these companies who assist in the lobbying to defend this ineffective punitive system. As far as prison labor itself goes, very little is actually contracted out to private companies. However, prisons do compel those incarcerated to do as much of the maintaining and operating of the prison as possible. Some states pay nothing for this labor, and in states that do pay, the average wage is 86 cents to $3.45 per day. Those unreasonably low wages are then recouped by the prison in exchange for toiletries, visitations, medical treatments, and other necessities. Prisoners who try to refuse to work may not only be denied these things, but are often placed in solitary confinement. Using prison labor in this way obfuscates the true operating costs of prisons, which continue to be the single most expensive part of the carceral system. Private prisons have therefore become a foil for reformists to tilt at ineffectively, while the state carceral system continues to expand and the number of lives it ruins continues to grow. Similar to this is the overemphasis on nonviolent drug offenders. While over 350,000 persons are locked up for some manner of drug offense, ending the war on drugs alone does not stop mass incarceration. What we see in states which have sought to decriminalize drugs is that it takes a couple of years for police to recalibrate and find a different script to follow to find reasons to lock up members of the carceral class. Another grave misconception is what constitutes a violent crime. Many people are led to believe that violent offenders, even violent drug offenders, must necessarily be the Hollywood style of murderous offender. This perception is frequently cited to justify excessive prison sentences under the banner of protecting society. However, violent crime is a legal distinction which can be as broad as purse snatching, stealing drugs, or even shoving someone. In many states, various forms of property crime, such as breaking windows or vandalism, is considered violent crime. Understanding how broad this definition is essential to understanding how the carceral class is systemically dehumanized and painted as an imminent threat. On the subject of violent offenders, let's talk a moment about the subset who have genuinely hurt or killed others, or have committed sexual offenses. The common thinking is that these individuals are too dangerous to be released. Yet, the data does not bear this out. We mentioned the recidivism rate earlier. This group of offenders has rearrest rates far lower than all other categories combined, with sexual offenders in particular ranking among the least likely to reoffend for the same crime. Mind you, this is not an appeal for sympathy for sexual offenders. This is a grave offense which does incredible harm to the victim. Rather, it is indicative that these individuals are capable of changing their behavior, and we should focus on how to better facilitate that change while taking better care of the victims. But what about those who do reoffend? Well, let's stop talking about statistics for just a moment and visit a concrete example and try to ask some questions. When we last checked in on Derek Davis, he was just being introduced to a local crew of drug dealers and making a decision to work for them to fight back hunger and help bring some income back home. Now known as Buck among the crew that adopted him, he has been working for them for 3 years, and his home situation is more stable than ever. Food is on the table, there's no longer an imminent threat of being evicted, and he has friends he knows he can count on for protection for himself and his family if it's needed. He's still just an adolescent, forced to make these adult decisions that I couldn't even conceive of. One night, they're all hanging out in a Wendy's parking lot, having dinner and chatting, when a rival crew drives by and shoots up the car. Buck, for his part, hits the ground, gets his own gun out, and blindly returns fire, emptying his clip. Raman, his best friend, his mentor, someone he has come to view as a brother, is bleeding out beside him. While at the hospital, grieving the announcement of Raman's death, he is caught up by the police. They're not concerned that he had just been in a vehicle that was shot at, or that he's grieving. They're looking to lock him up, because one of the people in the car doing that drive-by had been shot and killed as well. While they were unable to pin the murder on him, they did charge him with drug possession. During his 6-month stay, Buck is not thinking about reform. He's not reflecting on the wrongness of his actions. He's thinking about how his family will fare without his income, and making plans to resume it once he gets back. He's thinking about how his little sister tearfully screamed out his name when he was dragged out of the courtroom. He's thinking about his girlfriend, who he misses. The conditions which drove him to this life had not changed, so he had not changed. It took him just a few days after being released to fall in with some old faces and some new ones, and be tasked as part of kind of a proving job to put down some key members of a rival gang in order to secure a financial future for this new crew that he fell in with and himself. It was executed cleanly enough, and it would be years before it caught up with him. When it did, it was because someone who knew about it was put up for drug charges and gave up the body and Buck's involvement in exchange for a lesser sentence. While waiting for trial, before even being found guilty, Buck would be beaten, sprayed with mace, and served 2 stretches in solitary confinement. Then, at 23 years old, he was convicted and given a life sentence for murder in the first degree. It would be less than 2 years after that before his first suicide attempt. The common, prevailing attitude is that repeat violent offenders are simply too antisocial and dangerous to be allowed to walk among society. However, if we examine Derek's situation, there are 2 common threads. One is his motivational desire for himself and his family to remain housed and fed. However, there's another subtler lesson to be learned here. Everyone he is surrounded by is a member of the carceral class. There is no one in this story who could reach out to the police for help, as they are all forced to do things outside the law to survive. When they do interact with the law, there is no concern for their well-being or the well-being of their families. When Derek was initially arrested, there was no support given or no consideration given to his mother or siblings. Any interactions with law enforcement are negative and result in either being arrested or being pressured into giving up knowledge so that even more people can be arrested. They do not view police and law enforcement as a force for good. They view it as a constant and present threat. They are neither served nor protected by the police. When Derek and his friends were attacked at Wendy's, the concern of law enforcement was how to arrest Derek. It is important to understand that Derek, like the others in this story, are rational actors. He isn't just violent for violence' sake. He and those he was working with were trying to make the neighborhood safer for themselves and those they cared about by acting initially in self-defense and later in offense. This is not someone who is pathologically violent, and if we examine his circumstances, we can understand why the threat of prison and the threat of long prison sentences did nothing to deter his behavior, and why being in prison the first time did nothing to change his behavior. It also should not go unsaid that all of this was avoidable if food and housing security were a priority rather than punishment. You cannot punish the poverty out of people. This is not a story about right and wrong. This is about understanding how the system of mass incarceration fails to achieve any positive end. Now we're going to give a closer examination of prison life itself to understand how and why it fails to achieve any positive impact on those who are put through the carceral system.
The programs which we are submitted to under the facade of rehabilitation is relative to the ancient stupidity of pouring water on a drowning man, inasmuch as we are treated for our hostilities by our program administrators with their hostility as medication.
The prisoners of Attica Prison in 1971 developed and submitted a manifesto of demands. In this manifesto, they made clear that they recognized that they were in need of rehabilitation, but detailed conditions in the prison which were counterproductive to that end. They point out how they are being taught violence from the prison staff, kept ignorant of the outside world, and are isolated from friends and loved ones. They detail how they are denied medical treatments and expected to treat one another despite lacking both resources or training. They explain how their disparate religious observances and diet are ignored, and how blatant racial discrimination takes place in the treatment of prisoners. They demand having something as simple as legal representation during parole hearings and some kind of oversight of these hearings. They also demand fair wages for the back-breaking labor they are expected to do, and that industry working conditions standards are observed. They demand some input into inmate recreation and how funds are used to further their own treatment. This manifesto makes a few things clear in the demands that it makes. It details how prisons make prisoners less socially adjusted and more violent. It details how prisons deny prisoners the ability to make any decisions of their day-to-day lives, further destructing their ability to adapt to independent life. It details how prisons destroy any connection to friends and family that inmates may have by limiting communications and making them a financial burden, even if they are laboring full-time in the prison. This manifesto, and the massacre of the inmates which followed, is similar to if patients in a medical trial all complain that the medication failed to treat their symptoms and consistently made them worse. In this analogy, that feedback is not only being ignored, but the poisonous medicine is being prescribed in larger doses to more and more people, and the people involved in the trial who complained were slaughtered. But let's take this understanding a step further. I want you to take a few moments to think about what kind of environment would best work for you to make substantial changes in your own life. Perhaps you think of meditation or quiet, deep introspection. Maybe you would best achieve this surrounded by supportive friends. Maybe you need an accountability partner to provide quiet but steady encouragement. Really take a moment to reflect on what would help you to facilitate a transformative life change. Pause this video if you need to. Do you have that mental picture in your head? Good. Now let's have a look inside a prison. It's just this, day and night. It's horrible. Could you even hear yourself think in an environment like this? Is it any wonder that prisoners very often leave prison worse than when they entered? What hope could anyone have of rehabilitation or social growth when they are not even being treated like human beings? A common refrain is that we should not make prison conditions better, or people will seek out being imprisoned. This attitude is nothing more than a race to the bottom. The worse things get for people living outside prison, including the homeless, the worse things have to get inside prison. This is the policy the United States has followed for decades, and it has failed spectacularly at reducing criminality. It should also not go merely implied, but the prison experience is far worse for members of the carceral class in particular. That is, Black and brown individuals, Indigenous, queer, or non-Christians. All of these groups are more likely to face harsher treatment for their lifestyle, beliefs, or race by those who are supposed to be in charge of overseeing their protection and rehabilitation. While the environment is destructive to anyone entering the carceral system, these marginalized communities are chewed up the worst by it. As a final point, let's talk about what release from prison looks like. Exiting prison throws a previously incarcerated person onto the street, knowing full well they have no income and no ability to pay bills. If they do not already have a support network lined up on the outside, they will end up on the street, falling back into criminal behavior to survive. There is a haphazard system of halfway houses, almost entirely propped up by charity, which selectively choose to help some individuals. Some of these halfway houses are extensions of churches and use the desperation newly released people find themselves in to coerce participation in their religion. Muslims in particular find themselves abandoned by this system. There are also parole releases, where we see all of these problems manifest to ensure technical failures and perpetuate incarceration. Prisoners are expected to attend programs or fulfill certain tasks, or be present for meetings laid out by their parole agreement. These programs very often require payment to attend and require transportation, another cost. These burdens are placed on people before they even have a source of income or a roof over their heads. In interviewing a parole officer about her job, she explained to me that she viewed part of her job as giving her parolees the slack they needed to get themselves and their lives back together. She would routinely, deliberately overlook technical violations as long as she felt they were doing their best. Not all parole officers are so understanding. It is very telling that the most effective way to help a released person get back on their feet is to completely ignore and subvert the law. When parole obligations are strictly adhered to, a majority of the time parolees are simply unable to fulfill them. And the results we see from this system are that white offenders are given the most leniency for parole violations, with black men in particular receiving the least leniency. Dr. Amir Hassan Loggins notes that it is not hyperbole to suggest that the slave ship was an aquatic prison. As we have examined in the threads of history, we can see how the fingerprints of slavery are all over the modern carceral state. It is time that we start questioning this foundation. It is time that we should pick up those grievances the men and women of Attica Prison voiced, and demand a system that actually succeeds at creating positive outcomes. Taking all of that in, this raises a question. Why are so many people okay with how things are today? Why is it so impossible for many to imagine a better system, a world without police? To understand that, we have to look at propaganda. Police, historically, were broadly disliked everywhere they were implemented. In England, the United States, France, and elsewhere that adopted them, they have been viewed as incompetent, needlessly violent, backwards, expensive. Looking at various writings and political cartoons, music and art, the attitudes towards police have historically been quite negative. Even early cinema portrayed them as bumbling and useless at best, and cruel and oppressive at their worst. In the 1890s, the Luxau Commission detailed it in its findings that the police were extorting the public for upwards of $10 million per year in New York State alone. The harassment of citizens was a constant, well-known phenomenon, and even though it was primarily aimed at the black and immigrant populations, everyone felt it to some degree. They were broadly and accurately viewed as the biggest, most violent gang in America. Through the early 1900s, however, movies were catching on, and they were slowly beginning to lose this portrayal of the police officer. Not because public attitudes were changing, but because Hollywood directors were reliant on police to secure sets and to get shooting permits. Directors who wrote screenplays which showed police characters in a poor light would find themselves unable to get the permits they might need to film in a timely manner, or they might find themselves under heavy scrutiny and investigation, or the other actors on the film would find themselves under that scrutiny. All of this would hold up the process of filming, make things inconvenient, might create news stories, and public embarrassment. They were being effectively harassed into silence on the matter of police brutality. While this was slowly eroding the image of the police in film, there was a pivotal and major shift that occurred with the creation of the show Dragnet. This show pitched itself as showing real stories of the job of police officers. However, the scripts were all vetted by the LAPD, who maintained a strict veto power on any element of the show. As a result, this pseudo-documentary ended up being nothing more than propaganda for a police institution who, up until now, was known entirely for its predatory nature. The show challenged this experience that so many Americans had, and successfully sold the image of police as honest and fair men doing a difficult job to be a stabilizing force in society against the criminal elements that wanted to break it down. The same year that Dragnet first aired, 1951, was the same year as Bloody Christmas. On Christmas Eve, officers antagonized 7 men, 5 of whom were Mexican-American who were drinking at a bar. Despite having ID proving that they were of legal age, the officers insisted that they leave the bar. When the men refused, having no legal reason to leave, the officers rounded up 6 of them for arrest and dragged the 7th away to a park where they were beaten within an inch of their life. They required facial surgery and multiple blood transfusions to survive. The other 6 who had been taken prisoner were brought out and lined up the following day, Christmas Day. 50 police officers took turns violently beating them for over an hour and a half. Many bones were broken, their organs were ruptured, and they barely survived. The entirety of the incident was covered up for months. Dragnet, notably, did not cover this incident. It may have been the first propaganda show, but it was certainly not the last. In the comprehensive study of propaganda called Normalizing Injustice by Color of Change, the findings are stark. Police shows actually seem geared to shape public perception towards sympathizing with police even when they do something wrong. Police violence and breaking policy becomes the cost of public safety.
Almost all series depicted bad behavior as being committed by good people, thereby framing bad actions as relatable, forgivable, acceptable, and ultimately good. Remarkably, the data shows that scripted crime series depicted good guy criminal justice professionals committing wrongful actions far more than they depicted bad guys doing so. The likely result? Viewers feeling that those bad behaviors are actually not so bad and are acceptable, even necessary norms.
That is, an overwhelming majority of shows depicting police depict them doing wrongful actions more frequently even than the criminal antagonists of those shows. This framing is extremely dangerous. It creates a perception that police actions are always justified and above the law. It frames any restrictions or policies which limit police behavior as impediments to their ability to get the bad guy. That these laws and obstructions should be ignored as long as they do get the bad guy. This also reinforces the view that any criminal behavior warrants extreme violence done to the perpetrator or suspect of that criminal act. Think on some of the shows that you have seen which end in a standoff where the police officer guns down the criminal they're after, or where they fake evidence or break into places without a warrant. In some of the more contemporary shows, think on how police have IT experts on hand to breach other people's computers or set up sophisticated surveillance. These stories all suggest that police must necessarily always be able to do whatever they feel the need to do in the pursuit of catching bad guys, even if it means violating people's rights to privacy or fair trial. In these shows, officers rarely face any consequence for violating the law or policy in the course of their duty. Often they are commended. This perpetuates the assumption that this is all somehow normal and expected and should be celebrated. The study also finds that non-white or female officers are, in a majority of cases, deployed to acknowledge and give cover for wrongful actions carried out by police. Non-white and female officers are far more likely in their depictions of actually acknowledging an action or behavior as wrong, but overwhelmingly do not push back against it or are portrayed as active and enthusiastic supporters of it. This is especially true of cases of portrayals of black officers acting against black criminals. Mark Anthony Neal notes in his own study of propaganda,
in much of popular culture, black officers are no longer race men at all, but rather stand-ins for the very anti-black violence directed at black communities. As a whole, these characters are complements to the purposes of propaganda, serving as examples of black exceptionalism on the one hand while suggesting that policing is race neutral, but criminality is not. In fact, such characters help valorize and legitimize both the extra policing and extrajudicial forms of violence directed at black bodies.
These shows misrepresent the criminal justice system by presenting police actions as race neutral, but criminality as race oriented. The most common victims of crime in these shows are white men, with black women being especially rare as a victim of crime. This further reinforces the idea that criminality is not race neutral, that non-white individuals are simply much more likely to act out against white victims. Many of the tools of bias within the criminal justice system, such as racial profiling, are conspicuously absent. Coerced plea bargains, over-sentencing, and unreasonable bail are also typically not portrayed. All of these tools are used to disproportionately impact communities of color. A majority of shows present an inherently fair and unbiased justice system. The study finds that only 6 discussions about police reform were had amid the 353 episodes analyzed. Part of this failure to even consider racial elements of the criminal justice system may be due to the fact that, of all the shows studied, only 7% of the writers were black. The cop show genre is overwhelmingly dominated by the perspectives of white men, even more so than most Hollywood genres.
Regardless of whether a police show codes itself as conservative or progressive, the police officer is always the protagonist. He might be troubled, she might be working within a corrupt system and trying to change it from within, but it is always through their eyes that we see the world. And that's because the police built the genre that we use to talk about them. So today, even shows that are trying to self-reflexively critique the inherent flaws of the cop show find themselves doing so using the framework that the police built.
Even shows seeking to be critical of police struggle to do so, because the narrative is still being told from the police perspective. We have been indoctrinated into viewing the world through the lens of the police, of viewing them as the protagonists. None of this is an accident, and it may surprise you how much money has been poured into the effort and whose hands have been on that money. Some notable examples. The TV show The FBI ran from 1965 to 1973. J. Edgar Hoover, of COINTELPRO fame, was directly involved in the scriptwriting process to ensure that a very specific message was being tailored and sent out to the public. The TV show Cops, which began airing in 1989, was given life by Fox News mogul Rupert Murdoch. The rich and the powerful who benefit from these institutions the most have a vested interest in maintaining this image of police, and we should begin to scrutinize this relationship a lot more. This is an especially difficult hole to dig out of. It takes a lot of effort to deprogram as an individual, much less society as a whole. Even as you've been taking in this video essay, you've probably had the cop inside your own head, flaring up doses of cognitive dissonance. We have to recognize that this fantasy does not line up with the constant barrage of headlines of the impacts that police actually have. We all saw the constant clashes between Black Lives Matter protesters and the police through the summer of 2020. These images are not the ones that we've been fed our entire lives, but they are consistent with an institution which is inherently regressive, conservative, and seeking to maintain state power. We have to understand that these perspectives are written by people who do not have much experience with the carceral system and whose consultancy includes police constantly, but does not include criminals. Scripts are written and acted by people who are surrounded by former cops acting as bodyguards who have to interact with police to get set licensing and to have protection for their sets. We are not getting a clear picture from these media portrayals, but we must start somewhere. We have to start unpacking the assumptions and media portrayals that we've been fed about police our entire lives. We have to start looking at what police and the carceral system actually do within society, the function that they serve, the harm that they do, and we have to start asking, can we imagine something better?
The abolitionist future, to me, is about really investing in resources to address the underlying issues that people have in these communities. Right now, jail is what we got, but we also know that jails are harmful places. Jail is all about get back and vengeance. Everybody knows jails are fucked up places. They got millions of movies about it. It's like, you killed my father, I'm gonna kill your father. That sort of thing. We don't really think that this person we are sending to jail is redeemable, that a person can change. What does it do to send a person to jail? It doesn't do anything for them other than to say, we got you back.
As Marlon Peterson writes, the abolition of police and prisons is not about lawlessness. It's about stopping the outpour of resources into a system which fails to protect anyone and whose only byproduct is human misery. It's about putting those same resources towards building up communities, towards providing food and housing security, towards education. It's about investing in human well-being and enjoying the future that comes from a society built on a foundation of healing and mutual support rather than harm and vengeance. Like Derek, Marlon Peterson was driven to criminality out of his lack of necessary resources. While he was one of the lucky few who has escaped the carceral system, he attributes none of his life as a free man to his time in prison, but rather to the network of people in his life who supported him upon release. It must be stressed that the amount of resources needed to keep someone fed and housed is magnitudes less expensive than the ever-expanding punitive system we operate today. And every data point shows that providing these resources is actually effective at reducing crime where policing does not. And that's not even getting into the incalculable value of lives lost. Police are purely reactive force. They can't stop anything from happening. They show up after something has occurred, and they seek to deliver death and judgment. The abolitionist approach is a proactive one. It seeks to understand what is causing antisocial behavior and provide the support needed to prevent it from occurring in the first place. Abolition is not about lawlessness. It's not simply tossing police and prisons out and hoping for the best. It's about foundationally changing what we're putting all those resources towards and focusing on things that actually help people rather than harming them. You would still have people to call to, but they would be people from the community, they would be answerable to the community, and they would serve the community. Under the abolitionist framework, a victim of domestic abuse would be able to seek support without fear of losing the economic support their abusive partner brings in. That support might come in the form of counseling or intervention if that were desired, or even providing lodging and financial support for them to be able to escape their situation outright. Under the abolitionist framework, all kinds of crimes are less about proving the guilt of one party and more about determining what incited it, what harm was done, and seeking to remedy or resolve the underlying conflict. In many cases, there is more than one party at fault, and oftentimes the aggressor needs support right along with the victim. The punitive model creates a purely adversarial relationship within the courtroom, as the accused has only two options: escape guilt or be punished, whereas the restorative justice model focused on healing would allow admissions of fault or guilt to be discussed in earnest in the course of seeking a cure. It would fundamentally incentivize honesty. Under the abolitionist framework, a person would not have to face life on the street if they were unable to work or unable to find work. Removing people's homes and denying them food does nothing to encourage them to work, and only manages to create criminals and create harm, and is especially destructive to the less abled or those facing mental health issues. Under the abolitionist framework, those same individuals who do have mental health issues would not be constantly forced to interact with aggressive, armed agents of state violence. Rather, they would be assured the resources and support they need to live with dignity. The focus would not be on punishing them fatally for failing to fit the strict mold of a subservient corporate drone, but rather on securing them the same opportunity to enjoy a full life. And perhaps most importantly, under the abolitionist framework, a community would no longer be at the mercy of state violence. A community would be empowered to challenge unjust laws and systems without being subjected to tear gas, rubber bullets, and jail time. A community would be able to look after their own, and systems of accountability would be restored to the community itself. We can look and see examples of many of these things around the world. We can look to Finland's Housing First program, which has resulted in a significant drop in crime, a natural drop in homelessness, and has more than made up for its cost by reducing the amount needed to spend on law enforcement and mass incarceration. We can look to Portugal and decriminalizing drugs, how their safe use sites and rehabilitation support, and their comprehensive education on substance abuse has resulted in it being one of the only countries with a falling rate of addiction, as well as significantly lowered overdose and suicide rates. It has similarly reduced drug-related crimes, not just related to using and owning, but also those crimes that result in acting with impaired judgment in an unsafe environment. We can look to Norway's completely reimagined jail system, which focuses on allowing inmates to live autonomously and with dignity. It directs its guards to genuinely befriend and help socialize those in their care, and seeks to minimize sentence lengths. Their system gives those inmates the ability to pursue hobbies, education, and even work at reasonable pay at their discretion. They are encouraged to maintain their social bonds, and this focus on healing whatever drove them to criminality, and emphasis on providing a healthy example of well-adjusted life, has resulted in one of the lowest recidivism rates on the planet. We can look even in the United States to various programs which are rolling out like Cahoots, a community program which responds to emergency calls without the police. These programs lower crime, lower incarceration, they save lives by minimizing contact with police, and they have a better track record of actually helping those who call on them. These data points demonstrate how police interactions largely do nothing more than create criminals out of the most desperate and vulnerable. Most recently, the rolling out of the 988 program is also a step in this direction. By centering community-based systems of accountability and investment in people and their needs, by cutting back on the enormous expenditure of this failing relic of imperialist ambition, rooted in the persecution of minorities and built on the principles of slavery, we can begin to imagine a future where we are healthier, safer, and truly free. That is worth fighting for. Maybe you're convinced that we should abolish the police, or maybe you're still unsure about that, but recognize that things, as they are, don't work and need major changes. Understand that the state has every reason to hold tightly to their apparatus of state violence and subjugation, and will resist any efforts to fundamentally change it. This is a struggle that will be a hard-fought uphill battle. But there are things you can do today, if you are so motivated. If you want to try the electoral approach, 8 to Abolition lays out a series of policy recommendations which are primarily built on this framework. You can browse through their website and find some which resonate with your community and try to build popular support for a local or state ballot measure. If you want to try a more direct action approach, you could take after Cahoots or resilience systems or other grassroots efforts, either joining an existing or building a new community-driven power structure to begin replacing the reliance on police. One of the most difficult things for people to do is imagine that they could rely on some other force besides the police. But any programs which minimize contact with law enforcement can save lives. This kind of action helps to build the framework for a future without police by having those structures in place and allowing people to understand what those alternatives can truly look like. As mentioned earlier, there are over 2 million people behind bars in the United States. Operating or helping with a bail fund to help unconvicted people stay out of jail and prevent the disruption of their lives can help prevent them from becoming destitute and turning to criminality in the first place. For those who have been convicted, many are serving lifelong or decades-long sentences. Visitation and letter writing can mean the difference between living another day and suicide. It can also provide an opportunity to be part of a healing support network for when they are released. This action pierces through the curtain that this system of mass incarceration creates. It is a system designed to make these human beings invisible to the rest of society. It makes them disappear, out of sight and out of mind. Challenge that. Really listen to them. Hear their stories. Share their stories. Putting in time with local organizations, which help to prevent evictions or homelessness, can also help address those material needs and expand community power. The organization Food Not Bombs in particular states outright that its fundamental goal is to create a world which no longer needs them. There are many calls for more accountability for police. The truth is, police serve the state. They have never served the people. As we've discussed in their history, their foundational purpose was one of transferring power from people to the state and becoming an instrument of state violence to ultimately create jobs around this system of mass incarcerality and create a cheap labor force. If we want our system of law to be accountable to the people, then people must be the power behind law. Anything which empowers the community to maintain community well-being is an effort worth supporting. That first step is the hardest one, and as Mariam Kaba writes, nothing that we do that is worthwhile is done alone. If you learned something in the course of this essay, consider subscribing or giving it a like. It is my sincerest wish, however, that you have been moved to some kind of action. If you are either already doing stuff or are going to start putting in the effort today, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I am an imperfect messenger for this topic. Most of this essay is built on the works of much more well-informed voices who have been doing the work way longer than I was even aware of any of this. I am linking a starting list of recommended further reading in the description below, in addition to the various sources used. If you would like to support me in doing this kind of work, I do have a Patreon. If I'm ever able to make enough off this channel to support myself, I'll be free to not only do more video essays more frequently, but also have the time available to do more community work on the ground here. Also, a huge shout out and thank you to Aston Mac, Bink Princess, Endless Cemetery, Miko Inkwell, Psychosocialism, and Radhom for contributing their voices and input to this project. Their channels are linked below. Please give them your support. Thanks again for watching.